The northwest coast of North America, extending from the Alaskan panhandle south to northwestern California, was home to some of the most complex prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies in North America. They built magnificent structures called plank houses using axes made from jade that are today considered engineering marvels. They had complex hierarchical societies that have fascinated early anthropologists, and some of the earliest ethnographic studies were also conducted in the region. They had large populations, were organized into ranked societies, and had elaborate art traditions and engaged in considerable warfare and held slaves. Driving forth this complexity was the potlatch, a gathering where wealth and status were not just simply flaunted, but were given away to lesser-ranking members to impress them and secure their loyalty. Hi, this is Kirk, and I'm your guide, and in this video we will explore the prehistory of the Pacific Northwest. During the tail end of the last ice age, around 14,000 years ago, the first humans arrived in the Pacific Northwest, likely traveling by boat along a kelp highway of coastal islands or following the receding glaciers. In the high, sun-bleached desert of south-central Oregon, where the rim rock meets the sky, there is a place called the Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves. To the casual eye, they look like nothing more than shallow gashes in the volcanic rock, weathered by wind and ancient tides. But beneath the dust of the cave floor lies a story that challenged old paradigms. For decades, the story of America was a simple one. Clovis people, hunters with elegant fluted spear points, arrived around 13,000 years ago as the first human inhabitants on the continent. But in 2002, the earth at Paisley Caves gave up a different truth. Working through layers of silt and volcanic ash, archaeologists found something far more humble than a stone tool, yet far more revealing. Ancient coprolites, dried human feces. Through DNA analysis, researchers confirmed these were left by humans who walked these caves over 14,300 years ago. The people were there 1,000 years before the Clovis hunters were even a memory on the landscape. The people of Paisley Caves were masters of the sagebrush sea. Among the debris, there has been found fibers of sagebrush bark meticulously twisted into thread, and scraps of woven baskets. Analysis of the cave floor reveals they were eating not just bison and mountain sheep, but also rabbits, insects, and water lilies. They lived in a world where the Great Basin was a lush network of lakes and marshes, a far cry from the arid desert we see today. But perhaps the most striking discovery wasn't what they ate, but how they lived. Along with the DNA, there has been found a distinct style of stone tool, the western stemmed point. Unlike the Clovis points found elsewhere in America, these were thick and tapered. The western stem point represents a completely different lineage of craftsmanship, suggesting that while one group of humans was moving through the center of the continent, another, the people of the Paisley, had already carved out a life along the Pacific corridor. The world they inherited was one of raw, violent transformation. As the great ice sheets began their slow retreat, they left behind a landscape that was both a garden and a graveyard. The stone points of the people of the Western stem tradition were the apex of Ice Age engineering, designed to be secured to heavy shafts and driven deep into the flanks of Pleistocene megafauna. In a land where a single kill could sustain a band for weeks, the spear was the difference between life and a cold, silent end. But the earth itself was their greatest adversary. They moved through a shivering tundra, a treeless expanse where the wind never truly stopped. And always there was the water. To the north, as the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, a number of massive lakes formed behind dams of ice. One such lake was Lake Missoula, located along the border of Idaho and Montana. It was a massive lake, as large as several hundred miles long, several thousand feet deep, and containing some 500 cubic miles of water, more than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. Between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, Lake Missoula may have formed and drained some 40 times, each time eroding landforms, cutting deep canyons called coulees, and creating the great scablands of southwestern Washington. The floods were caused when the ice dams holding back the water snapped, releasing massive quantities of water. During the largest floods, it was estimated that the lake discharged more than 10 cubic miles of water an hour, which moved down the canyons at 80 miles an hour. Walls of water hundreds of feet high were released. If one were standing on a valley floor, one would see a wall of water coming towards them that was so high it would block out the horizon of mountains and hills. Nothing would have survived the rushing water and ice. If early Paleo-Indians were in the area during those times, they would have been killed, and evidence of their presence would now be jumbled up in alluvial deposits scattered across Washington and Oregon. These megafloods tore across the landscape, carving the coulees and stripping the earth to its basalt bones in a matter of days. To follow the western-stemmed hunters is to follow a ghost trail of survival. They were a people of the margins, walking the edges of disappearing glaciers and surging floods, watching the horizon for the silhouette of the mammoth and the bison. As the great ice finally retreated, the world began to settle into a new, more familiar rhythm. The warming air brought with it the rise of the massive coniferous forests, cedar, hemlock, and fir, that would eventually define the spirit of the Northwest. The rising seas, once erratic and hungry, finally stabilized, carving out the jagged coastlines we know today. This was the era of the archaic transition, a slow, profound shift from a life on the move to a life rooted in the land. In the basalt canyons of eastern Washington, at places like the Marmes rock shelter, one can see this shift written in the layers of the earth. People were no longer just passing through. For hundreds of generations, families returned to the same rock overhangs, watching the same sunrises over the Palouse River. The Marmes rock shelter is one of the most poignant chapters in Pacific Northwest archaeology, a site that offered a staggering 11,000-year continuous record of human life before it was tragically lost to modern development. From between 11,300 BC to 1300 AD, the site was occupied. Located near the confluence of the Palouse River and Snake River, its discovery in 1962 touched off a national sensation and a desperate race against time. For thousands of years, this 25-foot-high basalt alcove served as a tethered site, a permanent regional base where families returned generation after generation. The shelter's natural, cool, and damp interior made it an ideal ancient larder, filled with grass-lined storage pits for food caches. The site revealed thousands of artifacts that painted a picture of a sophisticated, connected culture. Among them were delicate bone needles with eyes the size of a pinhead, which were used for intricate tailoring. Olivella shells were also found originating from the Pacific coast, over 200 miles away, suggesting trade routes that spanned the region as early as 7,000 years ago. Additionally, ceremonial burial pits and cremation hearths were found filled with shell beads and stone knives, proving that complex mortuary practices were already deeply established 12,000 years ago. Most astoundingly, though, was the spring 1968 discovery of human remains. Deep beneath the canyon floor, archaeologists found the fragmented skull of a man who had lived and died 10,000 years ago, long before the first pyramids were built, and nearly a millennium before the famous Kennewick Man walked the banks of the Columbia River. For a brief, electric moment, Marmes Man was a national celebrity. Thousands of people flocked to the remote canyon to glimpse the oldest American, and the find was hailed as the key to unlocking the mystery of how humans first arrived on this continent. But the story took a dark turn in the press. Early reports falsely speculated that the charred remains were evidence of an ancient cannibalistic feast. In reality, the bones told a more tender story of ritual and reverence, a complex cremation ceremony that proved these early people honored their dead with sophisticated spiritual traditions. Marmes rock shelter became a national icon. School children were bussed in to watch archaeologists pull 11,000-year-old needles from the silt, while Washington senators fought for its preservation on the floor of the Capitol. It was a place where the deep past was finally speaking to the present. After being unearthed, the fragmentary human remains were removed for scientific analysis and stowed in university laboratories to protect them from the imminent flooding of the Marmes rock shelter. The Marmes site's end came with the construction of the Lower Monumental Dam. Despite a last-minute effort by the Army Corps of Engineers to build a protective levee and a massive public outcry, the site was flooded in February 1969. The water leaked through the porous gravel beneath the levee, submerging the Pompeii of the Northwest under what is now Lake Herbert G. West. During the 1980s and 1990s, an extensive inventory and curation project was conducted to catalog the thousands of items recovered from the site. The human remains from the site were reburied in the late 1980s or 1990s as part of this curation project. They were reportedly returned to the earth in a private ceremony at a nearby hillside, or a reinterment site near the original shelter, which remains largely undisclosed to protect the site's sanctity. As the Pacific Northwest region underwent changes 12,000 years ago, the hunting experience for Native Americans evolved. The days of chasing massive nomadic herds across open tundra were fading. As the forest thickened, the hunters adapted. They perfected the atlatl, a specialized spear thrower that acted as an extension of the human arm. This simple and elegant tool provided a hunter the leverage to hurl a dart with great speed and distance, allowing a lone hunter to strike from the shadows of the timber. Thus, using this tool, Native Americans shifted their focus to the elk and deer of the deepening woods and the silver wealth of the rivers. The stabilization of the environment, roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, transformed the Pacific Northwest from a land of survival into a land of plenty. As the glaciers finished their retreat and the sea levels hit their current mark, the cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Pacific began to fuel the greatest protein factory on Earth, the 5 species of Pacific salmon. The salmon did not just provide food, they provided a predictable surplus. This silver wealth meant that for the first time, people did not have to spend every waking hour searching for their next meal. They could settle, build, and create. Tribes engineered massive fishing weirs, intricate wooden fences built across river channels, and used dip nets from precarious scaffolding over churning rapids. However, the true innovation was preservation. By smoking and drying tons of fish, indigenous groups created a shelf-stable currency that allowed them to survive the lean winter months and trade with interior tribes for obsidian and buffalo hides. The massive and predictable runs of Chinook and sockeye became the heartbeat of the land. It was a wealth that did not need to be hunted across a tundra, as the fish swam against the current in numbers so vast they were said to choke the streams. This abundance led for the first time to a surplus, a bank of protein that could be smoked, dried, and stored. Thus, the great winter villages were born. There was finally leisure time to carve monumental art and weave the intricate stories that would define the region for millennia. Transition to permanent village life was sparked by a woodworking revolution that turned the western red cedar into the primary architect of Northwest culture. Western red cedar was a tree of miraculous properties, straight-grained, rot-resistant, and light. To unlock this resource, the Native Americans needed a special tool for the task. They found it in nephrite, a dense green stone we know as jade. By roughly 3,500 to 3,000 years ago, indigenous craftsmen began to harvest massive trees without felling them, using jade adzes to split planks directly from the living trunk. Carving a single jade adze could take 100 hours of patient grinding, but once finished, it was a tool of incredible power. With it, a craftsman could split a cedar log into thin, wide planks with the precision of a modern sawmill. For the first time, the nomadic bands of the past began to settle. The ability to split straight, durable cedar planks allowed for the construction of plank houses, some of which stretched over 100 feet long and housed dozens of people. These were not just shelters. They were communal hubs with central fire pits, raised sleeping platforms, and massive storage areas for the dried salmon that fueled their winter economies. One of the oldest known examples is the Maur site in British Columbia, featuring the remains of a rectangular structure that dated back to nearly 5,000 years ago. Located in Kinsalas Canyon, the Paul Mason site dating back to 1000 BC in British Columbia contains a village of at least 10 house-sized pits, providing some of the earliest evidence of a sedentary hierarchical society. The Meyer site is a massive late prehistoric plank house near Portland, Oregon, that was occupied for centuries. It is a prime example of how these structures were constantly repaired and recycled by the families living within them. The Palm Rose site on the Oregon coast reveals early rectangular plank house construction dating as far back as 2300 BC. These were the first true cities of the Northwest, permanent, towering structures of wood that stood defiantly against the damp chills of the forest. Within these walls, a new kind of society was born. The plank house became the center of the universe, a theater for the spirits, a warehouse for the salmon harvest, and a fortress for the family line. In the grain of the cedar, the people had found a way to build a world that would endure for thousands of years. The era beginning around 500 BC represents the golden age of the Northwest coast. It is a period where the abundance of salmon and the permanence of cedar architecture allowed for a social structure unlike almost any other hunter-gatherer society in the world. At the top were the chiefs and high-ranking families who owned the incorporeal rights to specific fishing spots, berry patches, and even certain songs, dances, and crests like the eagle or raven. Status was inherited, but it had to be maintained through the constant redistribution of wealth. Uniquely for non-agricultural societies, these groups practiced hereditary slavery. Slaves were usually captives taken in raids upon distant tribes. They were considered property and a primary indicator of a chief's staggering wealth. The potlatch was the legal and economic system that held this hierarchy together. A chief would invite rival villages to a massive feast lasting days. To prove his status, he would give away or even destroy vast amounts of wealth: cedar, blankets, canoes, and copper shields. By accepting gifts, the guests acknowledged the host's high rank. In the 2,000 years before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, the Pacific Northwest was home to one of the most complex and stratified societies on Earth. This was no longer a world of simple equality. It was a world of lineage, title, and prestige. The hierarchies of these societies were not maintained by force alone. They were also maintained by the potlatch. In a stunning reversal of modern economics, a leader's power was measured not by what he kept, but by what he could afford to give away. To host a potlatch was to put one's entire fortune on the line. A chief would stand before his rivals and redistribute hundreds of woven blankets, carved boxes, and precious oils. It was a high-stakes theater of generosity, a system where wealth was transformed into honor, and where the history of a people was validated through the act of giving. However, the potlatch was far more than a simple gathering. It was the Supreme Court, the bank, and the Parliament of the Northwest Coast all rolled into one. It served as a vital mechanism for keeping a society without a written language or a central government in balance. A high-ranking individual might spend years accumulating capital or wealth, thousands of dried salmon, hand-woven cedar blankets, and ornate bentwood boxes. At an event, these items were distributed to guests. The genius of the system was that the wealth did not stagnate in the hands of one person. It flowed through the community, ensuring that even the most distant relatives were provided for. Every gift carried a social contract. By accepting a blanket or a canoe, a guest was signing as a witness to the host's claim, whether it was a new name, a marriage, or the right to a specific hunting ground. The ultimate symbol of potlatch wealth was the copper, coming in the form of a large, shield-shaped plate of hammered metal. These were not used as tools. Instead, they were purely ceremonial. These objects were valued at the equivalent of several thousand blankets. In moments of extreme rivalry, a chief might break a piece off his copper and throw it into the sea. This was a challenge of such immensity that it was intended to compel a rival to do the same or lose face forever. In the modern world, we measure a person's success by the size of their bank account, but on the misty shores of the Pacific Northwest, the logic was inverted. To the outside observer, a potlatch looked like a spectacle of excess, days of feasting, storytelling, and dancing that could bankrupt the family. But beneath the mass and the smoke of the hearth fires was a sophisticated system of governance. Because there were no written deeds, the potlatch was where history was legalized. If a chief claimed a new title or a fishing territory, he had to pay the community to witness it. To destroy a copper or to give away a mountain of blankets was to prove that your spirit was greater than your possessions. It was a cycle of obligation that tied the village together. A gift given today was a debt to be repaid tomorrow. In the world of the potlatch, wealth was like the salmon. It was only valuable when it was moving, returning, and sustaining the life of the whole. For the macaw and their neighbors on the outer coast, the ultimate proof of a culture's strength lay in the deep water. They were perhaps the only people on Earth to hunt the great gray and humpback whales from hand-carved cedar canoes. The technology was a marvel of indigenous engineering. They used harpoons tipped with razor-sharp mussel shells, held in place by spruce pitch and sinew. To the back of the harpoon line, they attached inflated sealskin floats. These were not meant to kill the whale instantly, but were meant to instead act as a drag, slowly exhausting the leviathan and keeping it from diving into the abyss. It was a battle of endurance that could last for days, miles from the shore, guided by the songs and prayers of those left on the beach. But the most vivid window we have into this world came not from a story, but from a disaster. In the mid-1700s, during a period of relentless rain, a massive wall of mud broke loose from a hillside above the village of Ozette. In an instant, it slammed into a row of cedar longhouses, entombing them in a thick, oxygen-free clay. For 200 years, the village sat in a silent and wet grave. When archaeologists and macaw elders began to excavate it in 1970, they found another Pompeii of the Northwest. Because the mud blocked out the air that causes rot, the site gave back things that usually vanish: woven hats still showing the intricate patterns of spruce roots, wooden bowls carved into the shape of seals, and even the green leaves of plants tucked into baskets centuries ago. Among the 55,000 artifacts that were found were the earliest examples of the region's high art, such as carvings of thunderbirds and whales, which became the precursors to the iconic totem poles. Ozette proved that long before the first European ship was sighted, the people of the coast had already built a civilization of staggering beauty, held together by the strength of the cedar and the spirit of the whale.